And thank you very much for coming and showing interest in this topic, actually, on a Friday night. And so to make my trip worthwhile, I have quite a lecture planned for you. What I want to do is sort of three things. Put the deportation into the context of Chechen history, then talk about the deportation itself, actually not when people were rounded up and transported to the place of exile, but what they did in exile and how they survived in exile and how they acted there, especially how they acted differently from other people. And then at the end, I would like to come back to the present day and characterize Chechnya nowadays and say a few words about that, and also say a few words what I think the problems have been in creating peace and what the failings, in my opinion, are of the various sides. On the plane over here, I reviewed some materials from the last anniversary, actually from the 62nd and the 60th anniversary of the deportation. As anniversaries go, there are often occasions when people publish a lot of materials. Go ahead, have a seat. Don't worry. And what I wanted to start with is address the kind of myth that I frequently see in both Chechen literature and Western literature about the Chechens, and that is the notion that they have been fighting a 450-year war of resistance against Russian colonial oppression. And I think that really is a stereotype that doesn't correspond to the truth. To think of Russia as a colonial power before the 19th century is quite wrong. Russia was, as other steppe peoples around it, engaged in gathering up the lands of the Golden Horde, that is, of the Mongols. So they did what other powers in the steppe did, not much differently from them. They didn't use the sort of aggrandizement necessarily to oppress other cultures, to Russify them. All of that only started in the 19th century, and Russia was very aware of itself as copying European patterns of imperialism at that time. And it's only then, and it's the Caucasus that really made the break there, that Russians gained a sense of superiority vis-a-vis others in that region, let's say Tatars, Turks, Poles, other people in this vast steppe. And so I would say the Caucasus and Central Asia, the acquisition of Central Asia is where this break was created. There was a high point of Chechen resistance that takes place in the middle of the 19th century from 1832 to 1859. And I'm leaving out, of course, a lot of details. But the person, I think this is the most significant military action against the Russians. It was led by Shamil, and the structure that he tried to create was an imamat. And Shamil united people. He was actually himself not a Chechen, he was an Avar, and he united mostly Chechens under his leadership against the Russian and sought to impose the Shariat in Chechnya and in Dagestan. So that was a very kind of successful resistance as far as it went, that is until 1859. Part of that war, especially under a certain general called General Yermolov, and so some of these names that I'm mentioning, they're on your outline actually, were pretty similar to 20th century war in Chechnya in the sense that the Russians who were in the Caucasus really had no motivation to fight, and they certainly had no motivation to lose their lives over acquiring one or two more villages. And so what happened is that the Russians, just as they did in the war that started after 1999, stayed ensconced in their fortifications most of the year and ventured out only a few times a year. And then, of course, they had to show how warlike and fierce they were, because they only did this a few times a year. And so under General Yermolov, there was very little direction to the war and very poor tactics and also total absence kind of strategy. And so that war at times turned into a real war of extermination, which actually didn't gain much for anyone, either for the defending side or for Yermolov. And Shamil wasn't defeated until after the Crimean War. So they were not able to defeat this leader until Russia had been defeated itself in another major war and had begun a major set of reforms. That's also very important to recognize, that after the Crimean War, they were able to put a lot more troops into that area. I want to point out the reason I'm telling you all this, because I want to come at the end to the current strategy of assassinations in getting rid of the Chechen leaders that has seemed to be Putin's strategy for the last 5 or 6 years. And so I wanted to just point out, when Shamil was defeated, he was treated very different from, let's say, Aslan Maskhadov, whose body was displayed in very obscene manner on television. Shamil was celebrated. The Russians respected him. Shamil was brought to St. Petersburg. He was lionized by polite society. He went to all the big parties in St. Petersburg. He was introduced to the courtly society. So I think, you know, there's really no way to compare those two wars, the 19th and the 20th century. It was a different time. So although many people died, Shamil was taken serious and respected as an opponent. I would say, however, after that, there is no sort of unbroken resistance, as some Chechen historians claim, into the Soviet period. The Chechens encountered the collapse of the Russian Empire and the beginning of the Soviet Union much like other people. They, of course, also had their national leaders persecuted and arrested and spied upon by the NKVD. But I would say, even by comparison with other people, for instance, if you compare them to the Kazakhs, in the 1930s, they had their entire intelligentsia completely destroyed. That didn't really quite happen in this way to the Chechens. The Chechens also did not experience a total assault on their traditions, as did the Uzbeks, who had very violent unveiling campaign unleashed against them. So I'm making these points to say that up until 1944, they're quite similar to other people in the Soviet Union. They're modernizing, they're learning Russian, they're quite prosperous. You know, there are enough people to work in the police and the people joining the party and so on. There's nothing all that special about it. And here I'm really contradicting a certain historiography that asserts we were always fierce and always hated the Russians and it's always been Chechen-Russian opposition. I don't think that's quite true. So why the deportation in 1944? The first thing I want to say, it's not that unusual compared to the many other deportations during wartime. The Chechens, as other people, were suspected of working together with the Germans, with the Nazis in particular. This is, of course, a really controversial topic. Many Chechen historians say that's simply not true. Nothing of the kind ever happened. And there's a whole series of Russian publications that assert the opposite. I've also seen some German documents about that, and I think I want to carefully say, yes, there was some collaboration. There was a special unit called Verband Bergmann, and there was a certain leader and so on. So there are German documents about this, but I think the people who were in contact with Germans number in perhaps the dozens. So if we compare it to other Soviet people, the Ukrainians or the Belarusians went over to the German side by the millions. So in itself, this collaboration, there were a lot of people who were very anti-Soviet in the Soviet Union who had suffered terribly from decollectivization. And so all kinds of people had all kinds of reasons to run over to the German side because, of course, they had no clue what the Germans represented and what plans they had for them. So first I want to say that saying that some Chechens collaborated with the Germans, I think that's just stating the facts. We need to confront that and research more about that. But of course, it's no reason to deport an entire people. That does seem to be the main thinking in Stalin's mind, though he also deported Germans, before the German army could actually reach those populations on the Volga, and a whole range of other people. I'm not going to go into all of this, but a lot of them had to do with moving these people out of the path of the invading German army. In the Chechen case, of course, they were removed after the German army left the area, that is, in a sort of punishment. They were also not deported alone. They were deported together with the Ingush, their neighbors, and a range of other Balkars, other Caucasus peoples. Now, this is going to stay up. I'm going to get to the slides actually sort of halfway into my talk, and I just wanted to show you, this is a map of Kazakhstan, of course, and Chechnya isn't quite on here, right? It's somewhere over here, but the place where I did my research and where I really studied the Chechen diaspora is Astana, just so you have some idea of where that is. And for now, I'm just going to leave that up. So what I want to say, the deportation itself was not that unique. What was unique is how the Chechens acted in exile. of all the people who were in exile, they set an example to others by their resistance. The Chechens refused to send their children to school. They refused to let their women work in Russian work brigades. They refused to speak Russian. They refused in a whole number of ways to be in touch with the state and to have the state have any kind of power over them. Of course, they couldn't all resist getting onto the train and moving to Kazakhstan, because the people who resisted were shot. There's a whole village that was burnt up when the inhabitants resisted. So that kind of some kinds of resistance are simply not possible. But after they came to Kazakhstan, they tried in a myriad of ways to tell the Soviet state, we are not here of our own free will, and we will always do everything to return home. And that's the first difference to other deported people, and it came out very clearly in my interviews. All Chechens who I interviewed, whether they were male or female, whether they were quite elderly, that is in their 90s or somewhat younger, they all said, we never lost our faith in returning home. And that's very different to what Germans told me, what kulaks told me, what Ukrainians, what former prisoners told me. Even the prisoners of the Gulag in Kazakhstan sort of gave up hope and settled for a life in Kazakhstan, because it was very difficult to come back to the large cities of the Soviet Union. So my story today is about how the Chechens in exile pushed Khrushchev's thaw much, much further than what he had intended, and thereby set an example to other people in a major way. And this is a completely untold story. And it's even one that many Chechens themselves don't know. Because in the Chechen literature, and what Chechen young people tell me, is that the deportation was an unmitigated disaster. What I frequently see is very great exaggerations of the number of people who died. So when I reviewed this literature, that's fine. Well, I'll turn it back on later. When I reviewed this literature on the plane just now, I found claims on the government website, for instance, that half the people died in deportation, and most of the accounts focus on death and suffering. And so I want to tell another story, one that isn't that well known, and I think it's very important to address this historiography, because I feel that on all these anniversaries, not much new research has been done. Chechen historians have had no time to do research. Many archives have been destroyed. Their mind is really somewhere else. So of course, there are a few people doing research, but I feel a lot of it is politicized rather than really being open to asking questions and looking at the story in a kind of new way. So I want to start with some of the experiences. When the Chechens came, the Chechens in English, together they called the Vainach people, it's the term for the two people together. When they arrived at their destination, actually they came to Kazakhstan by about March 1944, because sometime in mid-March or even late March. So they were on the road quite a long time. They were in these cattle cars for 3 to 4 weeks and sometimes longer. So, of course, they arrived in Kazakhstan in an extremely traumatized and weakened condition. And it wasn't only that they didn't have enough food and that it was cold in those cars, it was very difficult for them to function in front of each other in those cars, because they have such a strict traditional culture. And so psychologically, they were even more traumatized by this trip in the train car than other people. Again, for instance, the Germans, who have a very much more practical attitude towards the body and aren't so ashamed. And when there's really a crisis, it's okay, you don't have to be ashamed. These people were not like that. They were still ashamed, and it cost them a lot of strength and a lot of emotions. So what the Kazakhs told me, I interviewed people around the Chechens. I didn't only ask Chechens what they remembered coming there, but the Kazakhs who met them, who were ordered by the NKVD to meet them. Well, first of all, they told me that the NKVD spread rumors that they were going to meet real devils. And so one elderly Kazakh man told me, he was 16 years old, and he said he went to the train station trembling, thinking he's going to meet people with horns and tails, quite literally. And then when he saw them spill out into the snow, the first thought that came into his head was, they have beautiful children, how can they be devils? And so he overcame his fear, and something he and many other Kazakhs overcame their fear And something that people told me again and again is that the Kazakhs were very kind to them and that they helped them and shared. The Kazakhs, maybe I should say a few words about what had happened to Kazakhstan up to this point. Kazakhstan had been completely destroyed by the Stalinist regime. It had been brutally collectivized. About 3 to 4 million Kazakhs vanished during collectivization out of a nation, I think, of about 8 or 9 million people. So the entire intelligentsia, Kazakh intelligentsia, was destroyed. So Kazakhstan was a very frightening and icy prison, and the people in Kazakhstan were themselves already traumatized when these new arrivals came. The other thing I ought to mention is that Kazakhstan was one of the hearts of the Gulag. When you think of the Gulag, usually you think of Siberia, right? But Kazakhstan is actually one of the main locations, both for the people who were prisoners in the institution called Gulag, and it became a prison of nations, quite literally after it had been emptied of Kazakhs. So this is the situation in Kazakhstan. Very frightening, everything untalked about, silence about everything, and very, very tangible oppression. And so the Chechens told me that the Kazakhs were kind to them and saved them, and sharing literally what little they had, and they had very little. These people were bitterly poor. Now, I was at a conference recently, and I got pretty upset. Someone was telling a story about this deportation, and they were saying, we were talking about the Chechen sort of disrespect for law, and I'm going to come back to that. There's a very profound and very proud disrespect of official law, and in fact, that helped people resist the regime in the deportation. And so this person at the conference, how did he put it? He said, well, it's no wonder that their neighbors were afraid of them. They saw them running through their gardens with their chickens. And then he sort of burst out laughing. And I wanted to turn to him, and then I didn't confront him at the conference, but I said, haven't you thought about what this means? How can you imagine men, really solid men who had 2 or 3 wives, who had many children, who had a large compound in Chechnya, and here they are in frozen Kazakhstan stealing chickens. Have you thought about how these people must have felt? So, I really feel that people sometimes read documents and they really don't imagine the story that's really behind there. So I wanted to read you some of these descriptions of when the Chechens first came to Kazakhstan. They believed it is better to die than to beg, because I can't explain everything that created that sense, but they feel that honor that is destroyed in such a situation can never be restored. So if you are reduced to the position of a beggar, when other opportunities come again, your honor cannot be brought back because everyone has seen you as a beggar. So their solution was to steal, and if not stealing, then indeed dying. And so the men especially were very, as one man told me, we were blind, we were confused, we were completely torn up by pain, and they couldn't accommodate this situation that they were in. So here's a description from the police report. On 13 March, I have to get my glasses. On 13 March 1944, in the village in the Frunze region, it's in the south of Kazakhstan, the Chechen special settlers Ibragimov and Khazatov Abdullah entered the flat of citizen Sargibayeva, drank 2 liters of milk, and fled. In the Stalin district in Frunze region, also, a group of Chechen settlers of 10 people broke into the milk product farm at night. I'm translating it just how it sounds in the document, the police document. They broke into the milk product farm at night and began to start the milking of cows. After noise was raised by the farm guards and after the arrival of the collective farmers, the special settlers, meaning the deported people, ran away, hitting one of the collective farmers in the process. And NKVD noted, we have started an investigation of this incident. The third incident, in the same district, in the Stalin collective farm, Chechen special settlers cut off 1 ear from each of 8 steers. The group of criminals was arrested and an investigation is being carried out. You understand about the ears, right? You can get a little bit of meat without killing the steers. If the steers had been killed, people would have gone to the gulag with 20 years of prison for that. But you can cut off the ear. Of course, it hurts the steer, but then you can cook the ears and eat some kind of soup. Okay? What could these investigations possibly reveal? The total physical exhaustion of the Chechens, famine-stricken people caught in a faraway land in a nightmare in which milking cows was an anti-Soviet incident. Desperate people drank milk and fled. And then, as you see later in the documents, and the authorities were quite worried about their capacity to make anti-Soviet statements. In fact, I think they saw the milking of cows as an anti-Soviet statement in itself. So what happened in the first years, the Chechens, in particular, the men, could not or would not work for the state that had sent them away from their homes as they thought to die. Many refused to work for the farm bosses, and those who worked for them were humiliated. And here's what one man told me about how he felt about how the bosses treated him. And actually, it's an interesting case. His own farm boss, I came to the village, and sort of no one knew me, and his farm boss sort of just ordered him out of the fields. And he was he was a big guy, you know, a farm guy, a worker. And he was like, he was sort of, why did you bring me in here to the office to talk to this woman, you know? And so he was kind of grumpy, and it was really hard to warm up. And in fact, the interviewing isn't always easy. It's not sort of a heartwarming process or anything. So he got quite mad at what he thought were my naive questions. And so what I'm reading to you, he said with some agitation. He said, I worked as a cattle herder for 25 years. In all this time, I never once humiliated my animals like they humiliated us. The commandanti and collective farm chairman told us straight out that we were to be the lowest of the low without rights. You didn't have the right to complain about anything to the chairman. They told you to sit, shut up, do what we tell you. Brigade leaders and chairmen would hit us, and there was nowhere to complain about it. And I should explain that for a Chechen man to admit that to me, a foreign woman, took a lot of courage for him. That is, to admit this humiliation, even though it was over 40 years ago, that was very powerful for him. And so in that sense, it was a very powerful interview, even though we both walked away from it feeling quite bad about everything. So it's oftentimes much, much later that things sort of come together. Now, on your handout, I've started to see the deportation also no longer as just one period of 13 years. And so I want to point out some of the events that were important and that caused changes in the deported peoples. The first one is the elections to the Supreme Soviet in 1946. Now, probably many of you think of the Soviet Union as a place where no elections went on, but they did. And the elections, it was actually a big holiday. They would paint the village, they would hang up slogans, and then everyone would come out and vote. And of course, not think about too much what they're voting for. And then at the end of the day, everyone would get drunk and sort of have a party. So the Soviet elections, it was a big deal, but the state sort of gave something to the people also for participating in it. So what the Chechens did in 1946, they refused en masse to participate in this election. Because they realized that they could disrupt it by doing so, and that then the Kazakh party organizations wouldn't be able to report, 95% of the people attended the election. And so Kruglov, the Minister of the Interior, Kruglov, reported to Stalin in 1946 as these elections were going on. The most reactionary among the Muslim spiritual leaders, he said, were openly hostile to the elections, and that they were calling on believers to boycott primarily for the overt reason that no Chechen or English candidates were among the candidates. Imagine just saying that in 1946 Kazakhstan, where everyone is just frozen with fear. I don't know how to convey what a screwed up place Kazakhstan was at that time. And so even just to say, we're not going to vote because there's no candidates of our nation was an outrage, And so what the police did, they increased its operative work among the deportees to prevent banditry and provocation. And they ended up arresting over 40 people for actively spreading this anti-election propaganda. What I wasn't able to find out is how many people actually refused. That is, what was the percentage of people who refused. But I have some data from later that I'll tell you about where they managed to agitate about half the people not to participate in something that was required. Now, in the course of this campaign, many Chechens expressed something that was absolutely unique among the deported peoples. I never collected anything like this from Germans, from Ukrainians, from in fact, anyone else. And that is that they expected that the restoration of their autonomy would be aided by the Western powers, including the USA, Great Britain, and Turkey. And that is, of course, also absolutely mind-blowing to have people saying stuff like that in Kazakhstan in 1946. So I wanted to read you a couple of quotes, too. This is the Chechen special settler Haidiev Mushhaji in Almaty. These are actually both from Almaty. I won't participate in the polling because the Soviet government did not send us to Kazakhstan to live, but to die. I would vote for an Anglo-American government with pleasure because it would be better than the Soviet. And then quote number 2, also from Almaty, also from 1946. After the elections, we will return to the Caucasus because England and America will help us restore our state. 1946, in the middle of Siberia, basically. That is why we will not vote for Soviet candidates. We are going to vote in the Caucasus for our candidates. So I could cite many more examples. The police collected actually quite a few examples of this. And I should say, some people also refused to vote, but for slightly different reasons. So I did find a quote from a German woman who said, I refuse to vote for this power because it is against God. And so there were other people, and the NKVD, of course, was really worried about such statements and collected them. But the Chechens were clearly the only deportees who had this hope for foreign intervention. And it's this period, I believe it's this agitation against the election that also reawoke the Sufi tarikats in exile. And I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. I'm going to talk about religion separately. Now I want to talk about the 1950s after Stalin died and when Khrushchev came to power. One of the very first reforms that he started, the so-called Virgin Lands campaign, it's probably something that you haven't necessarily heard of. It was always billed in the West as a grain-growing campaign that sort of went wrong, went badly, and as a result, the only thing that Westerners were interested in, are they really growing as much grain as they're saying here? And the answer was always no, and in addition, they caused soil erosion. So this was always billed as one of Khrushchev's sort of crazy projects. And when I went out there, the book that I'm writing about this Virgin Lands campaign and about northern Kazakhstan, I will show that this campaign, the virgin part of the Virgin Lands, was really to sort of obfuscate that this was one of the main parts of the Gulag. And so I'm going to argue this was actually a reform intended to rehabilitate Kazakhstan's Gulag, or at least that's how it worked out, whether Khrushchev intended it that way from the beginning or not. What it meant for Kazakhstan, some of it was negative, some of it was positive. Undoubtedly negative was the influx of prisoners and young people, pretty wild young people, in the first couple of years of the Virgin Lands campaign. Positive, undoubtedly positive, was the influx of tractors, of massive amounts of food, building materials, anything you could wish for. So Kazakhstan was suddenly flooded with resources, and it was flooded with young people. And these young people came to Kazakhstan expecting empty steppe. And guess what? They found it covered with people who they thought of as traitors. They had no idea they're going to find Caucasians there and Germans, fascists as they thought of them. And so what these young people did is they started to beat these people. And so there's this period in the early 1950s where hundreds of these mass fights and riots break out. And that's actually more typical of the 50s than we have known in the sort of scholarship. We're just starting to find out what a wild period the 50s really were. And that Khrushchev, after opening the camps, he really had trouble controlling the society. So in the Virgin Lands, there were a lot of fights. And it went, in some cases, to pogroms. That is, that the houses of Chechens and of Ingush would be burned, would go up in flames. So some of these cases were very significant. A lot of the fights involved, or some of the fights involved between 200 and 400 people. So again, for the Soviet period, this is very significant. And these fights frightened other people in Kazakhstan. and other deportees didn't get involved in them. So the Germans, for instance, no one, they were physically much less aggressive and ready to back down if someone confronted them. So the Virgin Islanders didn't like the Germans either, but there's a few mass fights that broke out, but nothing like with the Caucasians. So the police, however, blamed all of these incidents squarely on the Virgin Landers, and that's also very interesting. That's very different from Russian official media nowadays, who blame everything that has to do with Chechens on the Chechens, no matter what is going on. And here we see the secret police in the 1950s reporting quite fairly and really investigating the cases and investigating the causes of this violence. They said, this is not our Chechens. They already called them our in Kazakhstan doing it. They said, it's these outsiders, it's these young people who don't understand why they're here. Now what happened, the other thing, there's something else going on simultaneously in the 1950s, and that is that the police actually pushed Khrushchev to let all these people go in Kazakhstan. And so it was partially Khrushchev's idea, it was partially the idea of the secret of the leader of the, what was by now called the MVD, the Ministry of the Interior, rather than the NKVD, the Commissariat of the Interior. And the reason they wanted to let these people go is because they didn't have the resources to monitor them anymore. Do you see? And the reason is that they were having more and more children. And so what was happening is that the special settler population was growing by leaps and bounds because the people were having children, and the police was forced to put these children on the special settler rolls. And so when the amount of children grew to about a third of the entire population, they said, we have to stop. We have to somehow release these people from their status. So because Khrushchev didn't have a clear plan from the beginning, he was kind of ambivalent. In a way, it's like Gorbachev in the 1980s. He was clearly a reformer. He had passion for people. He wanted to improve their lives, but he had no ethnic vision whatsoever. That was also Gorbachev's undoing, you know. I believe he had good intentions, but he really didn't understand that the experience of non-Russians was different than that of Russians, and that was a real blindness. So Khrushchev was quite similar. And so because he didn't have a clear plan, the deported people could push the reforms, and that's very important to understand. If they hadn't done so, they might not have gone as far, because Khrushchev wasn't sure what he wanted to do ultimately. So there was a series of laws issued, and again, there was a lot of political activism. The first law that came out allowed people to move around in their republic. They weren't allowed to go home, but let's say they were sent to Kazakhstan. It gave you the right, you were still a special settler, but now you were free to move around the republic. What the Chechens did with this is that they undid this sort of dispersion that the regime had forced them into. Families had been torn apart, clans had been torn apart, relatives had been torn apart. So they used that first phase to bring together their relatives and to come back together in these clans, or at least to try to, as they had been living in Chechnya. And so the secret police again got really worried, because in the first 2 months after this new law was issued in 1954, 19,000 Chechens left the north of Kazakhstan and moved to the south of Kazakhstan. That was fully half of the special settler population. And that is of the Caucasians. And again, the other resettled people didn't do that. The Germans were too hesitant and too timid to do that, because you still had to confront the bosses. You know, just walk out of the place where you were living, go south. They didn't care. They said, the law is on our side now, we're just gonna go. So I don't really have time to go into all the details of the freeing of these people from exile. But what I want to emphasize is that what was crucial is that the party, by 1955, 1956, was unable to stop the migration flows. People just started to leave Kazakhstan. They started to go back to Chechnya in little groups. They started to check out what's going on with our houses. A lot of people had been moved into their houses. And then by about late 1956, actually after Khrushchev's secret speech, that's very crucial here, they just started to go home. They bribed officials, they bribed the police officials. They're shutting the hall down over there, I think. And they just started to leave Kazakhstan. In Akmolinsk, in the region that I'm studying, of 17, with just one relatively small region, of 17,000 adults, only 7,000 remained after this period. So these people were serious about leaving. So in 1956, the Chechens, Ingush, and another people, the Karachayevцы, were released from the special settler rolls. And then the government told them, the police told them, you have to sign a document saying that you understand it is forbidden to go back to the Caucasus and that it is forbidden to sue for the return of the properties that you lost when you were deported from Chechnya. And I'll make the story short. They agitated again to get people to refuse to sign this document, and they were quite successful. Of these, and this is before, of these 17,000 adults that I just mentioned that were in the region before this outflux started too, 7,000 refused to sign. And so here I was able to find documentation of how many were able. And I think this is really significant political grassroots organization and resistance, and no one else was doing that. The Germans started to do some of this. The Germans started to go to Moscow to agitate to be allowed to go back home. And they had some success because the German chancellor visited the Soviet Union in 1955, Konrad Adenauer. And I'm sorry I'm bringing in all this sort of stuff from all over Western European history, right? But this is important because the Interior Ministry and Khrushchev gave in order to sort of make a present to Adenauer. And what happened as a response is, of course, all the other people who had been deported were very upset by that, especially the Chechens. They said, how are we any worse than the Germans of all people? You know, you're freeing them from this special regime, but not us. And so again, you know, to study the timeline of all these laws that were issued, you really need to read about it. I can't tell that whole story here, but the point I want to make is that they pushed, and the party ended up having to let them go because they couldn't control these people. The next thing I want to turn to is religion. What gave the people strength and emotional strength and the strength to hold together and the strength to hold fast in this belief that they would go home. Undoubtedly, a very large part was played in that by religion. Now, many Chechens are. This is going to be a sort of mini capsule. I'm not sure if it's going to make sense, but many Chechens are Sufis, and Sufism is a less official version of Islam, and I can explain this better, but I'm going to keep it really short. And it's split up into several paths or tariqats that are quite recognizable in other parts of the Middle East too. And so some of these tariqats were present in Chechnya, and in fact, Shamil, who I told you about in the 19th century, he was quite suspicious of these people. He used some of them for his uprising, but then he really wanted to bring in the Shariat and not really suppress these Sufis, but control them better than they had been up to this point. So Shamil represented official Islam, and that's an oversimplification, and Sufism is a kind of unofficial Islam. Again, that's also an oversimplification, but it might help to understand what's going on here. Most of the Sufi murids, they're called, the students of a Sufi leader who is called an ustaz. They come from two tariqats, Naqshbandiya and Qadiriya. Again, these are tariqats that exist outside of Chechnya too. And in exile, all of these tariqats, all of these groups, or many of these groups began to revive. By 1955, by the count of the Akmolinsk, and this is just in my little region, well, that's gone, in that Astana region that I showed you, according to MVD operatives, more than 20 Sufi groups were active in the region. And the NKVD monitored them and showed that they moved all over the republic. They held court. They were brought in to resolve conflicts. They collected money for the work that they did at these kills, at these courts, and for advising believers in sort of spiritual affairs. So there was a very lively religious life. And the police tried to monitor it, but they weren't able to oppress it completely. And I should also say that a year later, in 1956, the camps literally open up, and thousands of priests and monks and religious people who were in the camps come flooding out of the camps. And in Kazakhstan, that was really noticeable because Catholicism, Lutheranism, all sort of sects revived. The Baptists, the Mennonites came out of the camps. And so that's a really amazing period. If one of you has ever heard of Khrushchev's crackdown on religion, the reason he cracked down on religion because religion was getting out of hand by 1957. So I see that quite differently also than the general history, than the general picture that is Khrushchev cracked down on religion. Yeah, but because there were churches, home underground churches being founded in practically every village, in particular in the regions that were around the camps. Now, the movement I want to tell you about really briefly is one that was founded in 1948 in exile, and that movement is called Vishaj. So I wanted to tell you about this sect. Well, sect is really not a pretty word. It's not a polite word, right? But it's a movement, a Sufi movement that was founded in exile. And another name for it is white hats, Belosharpashniki. They're quite well known. And after exile, they spread back to Chechnya. That is, even during exile, this movement came back to Chechnya, and it was quite... it has developed quite a following, although some people stay away from them. They say, well, those are heretics, as usual in religion, right? People have quite exclusive ideas. But this Vishaj movement was very, very important. The leader of this movement was, was Uwais Vishaj Zagiev. And he believed he was, what people told me about him, he was widely viewed as extraordinary. He was credited with having visions. He was credited with being able to speak with angels. And all of the people who I interviewed in his village, that is, who had still known him in the villages around him, actually avoided saying his name and spoke about him in a very respectful way. And I spoke to his student, the current ustaz of this movement. And this movement remained in Kazakhstan because Vishaj ended up being buried in this place, Krasnaya Polyana, it's called. And so it's a site of pilgrimage, but it's also a place where Chechens have taken 3 villages and just made them their own. It's a real Chechen enclave. It's also the only place in Kazakhstan that has a Chechen middle school, a school in which everything up to 10th grade is taught in the Chechen language. That's an absolute rarity. But so the current leader told me this about Vishaj. He never asked for a second helping of food. And he's talking about the years 1946, 1947, when there was extremely little food to go around. He always lived poorly and never looked for riches. Excuse me. He never took money. I began to love him and stayed close to him, not wishing to miss a single of his words. He preached the demand to live purely, to live with your heart, and this teaching spread all over Kazakhstan, all over Ingushetia, Chechnya. This was a major teaching, and for this the state persecuted him. But he considered this Allah's business. He preached and taught cleansing, and for this people came to see him from all over. He called people to live and live with him joyfully. And what was unique about this movement is that it allowed women to participate in the ritual functions, and especially it allowed women to participate in the zikr. The zikr is a Chechen dance in which usually only men participate. It's very powerful. It's I'll show you a picture, but it only shows part of it. It's a circle, and people move around in a circle faster and faster. I guess the aim is to reach a sort of ecstasy, mutual common ecstasy. And so I had a zikr done for me in my honor in Krasnaya Polyana, and it was very interesting to see women participate in it. So it's a very unusual movement for that fact alone. And people told me that women came from all over Kazakhstan who had lost their husbands, who had lost their families, to live in this community and to live in a pure Chechen way. And how did this place managed not to get in trouble with the authorities? Well, what Vishaj did, he mobilized, he told people on the one hand not to speak Russian, to stay away from the state as much as they could, but then where it counted, he mobilized them for harvest work and for agricultural work that the state demanded. So he told them, be obedient in those matters and they will leave us alone sort of and then we can live on our own. And for whatever reason, the force of his personality, I mean, he was enormously respected all over the region. He managed to pull it off. And so that village, those 3 villages still exist. That's really a very, very interesting testimony to how people revived their cultures in exile and managed to do so against the state that really didn't, or against the Communist Party that really didn't want that to happen. I'm almost finished. And then I'm going to show you some pictures, and then I'm going to turn to the current situation in Chechnya. All I really want to say is that now in the place where I studied in Kazakhstan, it's sort of compared to what I know about Chechnya, compared to how Chechens live in in Europe, all over in exile now again, in Russia, it's sort of, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of it's a little fragment of Chechnya that's still whole, that's still okay. And that's especially ironic considering that this was a place of exile and of deportation. But compared to Chechnya now, especially the last few years, with everything destroyed, with the spirit destroyed, with people in such enormous fear that pervades everything. When you go to Kazakhstan and talk to Chechens there, it's a totally different atmosphere. People are really more relaxed, and not that any Chechen would ever deny, they would always say, I'm proud of being Chechen, but in Russia that can certainly get you in trouble. Kazakhstan is a nicer place, and sure you can get in trouble there too, but it really is more tolerant of many different minorities. And so nowadays, in the region that I studied, about 7,000 to 8,000 Chechen remain just in that one region. And when I was there in 2000, about 10% of them were refugees from the war in Chechnya. So they were people who went back to Kazakhstan. This is a typical Chechen village. This is a high mountain village, and I'll show you another one. Again, I can't linger on these too much. This is another village, Sharoy, it's called. And here, especially in this one, you see really well how these are almost built into the mountains, and they perch sort of up really high. And I read a description of what it's like to sit on the roof of one of these and to look almost over the entire Caucasus range. And so psychologically, it must do something to people's psychology. They perch like eagles on these high mountains, right? You know that mountain cultures they're difficult people everywhere, right? Just think of the Swiss, for instance, and how they've, right? what other, we have some mountain cultures here, right? That sort of refuse to fit in. And so people in mountains think of themselves as different, as certainly lowlands people. That says it all, right? And so this is part of Chechen psychology, I think. This is Kazakhstan, a very Soviet-looking Kazakhstan. As I first encountered it. So it says Kolutonsky Savkhoz. This is long after. This is actually the prosperity, the modest prosperity, I guess, in American eyes, that was built up by the Virgin Lands campaign, that I argue was this rehabilitation of the Gulag. So this was before it was slightly after the collapse of communism, but again, it was still a very Soviet place in the early 1990s. Many of these signs are gone now. This is a Kazakh cemetery. This is this is me. This is a Kazakh historian, and this is a village mullah. And the reason I have this picture in there is because this woman told me something very interesting. I was taking pictures of all these cemeteries because I guess they were exotic to me, when I first came to Kazakhstan. And of course I didn't do it inside, but sort of from the car. And then I met this woman, Clara Emirkizi is her name. And she told me, you know what, girl, you have no idea. These are all, and I was taking pictures of the cemeteries by the roadside. And she says, you know what, usually these cemeteries are way further hidden in the countryside. You know what these roadside ones by the highway are? She said they were all created in the years of the famine. So that every cemetery that you can see from the car is a cemetery that was founded in 1932, 1933 after collectivization. That's something no book can tell you, right? Only someone who lives in that region. That was a real insight to me. A bit chilling, So this is a multinational work collective in Kazakhstan just before the Virgin Lands started. This is like 1949, 1950. So who is who here? These two, this is an Englishman, this is a Polish man, an Englishman, Polish, no, English. The women are German, another Pole, and here's the NKVD guy. He's Russian, okay? I mean, not to put labels on anyone, but still to explain what you're seeing there. And I think especially this man's, the attitude comes right through, right? What's with the standing in front of everybody and going like this proudly? So I think even the body language of people was different, and it expressed their attitude to the regime. Maybe that's banal, it's just one little picture, but knowing everything that I know, it does seem to kind of show that. Another really interesting, this picture is 1948. And I think what's really astonishing about this now, Chechen culture strictly forbids touching, especially what the US military calls PDA, public display of affection, is not allowed. Many Muslim cultures forbid that. It doesn't mean that people don't love each other, they just don't show it in public, right? What's amazing about this picture, look at how everybody is clinging to each other. Men to women, the man is holding a baby. Chechen men aren't supposed to hold a baby. That's, you know, women, give it to the woman, have her, especially on a picture. But this picture is immediately after the deportation. Now this is in Krasnaya Polyana. These are three men, they're members of the Vishachi, you see, and they're called Bieloshaposhniki in Russian with these white hats. And they're singing what's called Nazim. It's a spiritual song. And I don't have a text of one, and I think it would require a different kind of setting, actually, to study the text. They're mystical and you know, not easy to explain in sort of 5 minutes. So I'll just show you the picture. And this is a really interesting story. This is a picture. This is from the Chechen middle school, in the only Chechen middle school, I believe, anywhere outside of Chechnya. I mean, I don't think that there's a Chechen middle school in Russia, anywhere in the Russian Federation. That's not Chechnya. And so it's a very multicultural story. This is perfect for Berkeley. This is drawn by a Chechen boy. And what they're doing is they're translating travel stories by Alexandre Dumas, the French traveler who went to the Caucasus in the 19th century. They're reading him in Russian, of course. So they're reading Alexandre Dumas in Russian. And this particular text that they chose to translate is called Dress of the Mountain Man. And so they have the passage here in Russian, and then they translate it into Chechen, and then he drew how he imagines the Caucasus. And this is a boy who's never been to the Caucasus, you know, who's grown up in Kazakhstan in the completely flat steppe. And so what's important, of course, the kinjal, this knife, and the pose is very important. This burqa, this black coat. So everything about this is quite classic and important. So it's really interesting to see how these kids out there study their own culture.
What is school at?
Naryad Gartsa, it's Alexandre Dumas. It's just a fragment.
Was this school officially established in the exile?
What, this school? Yeah, it exists now. There's a teacher there now who teaches. But no, it was later. It was in the 1980s. Ah, that's a good question. The school was established in the 1980s, actually, in the Gorbachev period. These are not Chechens. I just wanted to show you another picture. These are other deportees, actually. This is a German deportee, and this is her best Kazakh friend, and just wanted to show you, throw it in there, so you see the village a little bit, see how the houses look and so on. These people are actually quite poor, and not everyone, you can't always judge how well off they are from how they're dressed and so on, because these are also farm people. They don't dress up to go to work, right? So if she had dressed up for a holiday, she might look, both of them would probably look nicer, but they were quite friendly. Now, this is a picture I wanted. This is from the Zikr. It's the only one I brought, actually. So this is the current ustaz of this village. And so, you know, it's not the best picture, but I think it shows what joy there is to experience in this religion too, and something of what it gives to people, and also again that women participate in it, which is really rare. And so that's an innovation that happened in exile, and that some people in Chechnya are a little bit suspicious of. Actually, I found that out when I interviewed people in Moscow. Actually, they said, "What are you doing out there with these crazies?" Kind of. Yeah, I'm gonna go back to that. I don't know how I managed to do that. Open this up. And then I have a couple more. I don't want to. There's two more things I wanted to show you. There's two monuments I wanted to show you. This is a monument in White Russia. It's a place called Brest. And this has to do with the reason for the deportation. The Chechens, of course, say, you know, even those who don't completely deny that collaboration took place, even if it's a few dozen people, say, well, what does it mean a few dozen people collaborated? thousands of Chechens died fighting the German army. And the Brest castle was one of these places. It was enclosed, it was beleaguered by the Germans, and many people died defending it. And so they've put up these monuments that for the first time show how multinational were the units that defended Brest. And so Chechens actually sort of pilgrimage to this place in White Russia because they're so pleased that their Chechen names are here. So this one is Ryadavoy. It's the lowest rank, I guess just Private Abdrahmanov Salih Idrisovich. And so the persons who I came there with, they were in tears just seeing that name on this monument as a recognition of their service in the war. So this may look, you know, aggressive. It's typical Soviet style of commemorating the war, but it is meaningful actually to quite a few people. I wanted to point out the Putin strategies just very briefly. The first one is to isolate Chechens and Chechnya in a sense from international opinion, to frame them in the international war on terror, so that everything, you know, sometimes when I talk to people about Chechnya, I don't think they hear Chechnya, they hear me saying Palestine, and they just can't get out of that, you know? So whatever you say, it's sort of framed in this larger framework. He worked very hard to call the war an anti-terrorist operation. And while it was going on, we won't let him get away with that. It really was a war. And so I think that's really the last thing I want to point out. And I know that this last part probably hasn't been very clear because I focused more on the deportation. So I'm ready to hear your questions, actually, about whichever period interests you, either the deportation or the current day. Thank you very much for your attention, and I've been just happy to tell you about all these things. Now I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
You've been watching Peace Band.
Each week, we bring you one of the many events that take place at Berkeley City College, the College of Alameda, and Laney and Merritt Colleges in Oakland.
For more information about our program or Peralta events, visit our website, peralta.tv. We'll be back next week with another exciting event. Thanks for tuning in.